Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the World by C.G. Jung Epilogue. I had already contemplated my manuscript when a little book fell into my hands which I sought not to leave unmentioned, The Secret of the Saucers by Orfeo M. Angelucci, Amherst Press, 1955. The author is self-taught and describes himself as a nervous individual suffering from, quote, constitutional inadequacy, unquote. After working on various jobs, he was employed as a mechanic in 1952 at the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation at Burbank, California. He seems to lack any kind of mental culture, but appears to have a knowledge of science that exceeds what would be expected of a person in his circumstances. He is an Americanized Italian, naive, and, if appearances do not deceive us, serious and idealistic. He makes his living now by preaching the gospel revealed to him by the saucers. This is the reason why I mention this book. His career as a prophet began with the sighting of a supposedly authentic UFO on August 4, 1946. At the time, he had no further interest in the problem. He was working in his free hours on a book entitled The Nature of Infinite Entities, which he subsequently published at his own expense. He describes his contents as atomic evolution, suspension and involution, origin of the cosmic rays, etc. On May 23, 1952, he underwent the experience that gave him his calling. Towards 11 o'clock in the evening, he says, he felt unwell and had a prickling sensation in the upper half of his body, as before an electrical storm. He was working night shift, and he was driving home in his car, and he saw a faintly red-glowing oval-shaped object hovering over the horizon, which nobody else seemed to see. On a lonely stretch of the road, where it rose above the level of the surrounding terrain, he saw below him the glowing red disk pulsating near the ground, only a short distance away. Suddenly it shot upwards with a great speed at an angle of 30 to 40 degrees and disappeared towards the west. But before it vanished, it released two balls of green fire, from which a man's voice issued, speaking perfect English. He could remember the words, "Don't be afraid, Orfeo. We are friends." The voice bade him get out of his car. This he did, and, leaning against the car, he watched the two pulsating disks hovering a short distance in front of him. The voice explained to him that the lights were instruments of transmission and reception, i.e., a species of sense organs, and that he was in direct communication with friends from another world. It also asked him if he remembered his experience on August 4, 1946. All at once he felt very thirsty, and a voice told him, "Drink from the crystal cup, and you will find the fender. Drink from the crystal cup you will find on the fender of your car." He drank, and it was the most delicious beverage I have ever tasted. He felt refreshed and strengthened. The twin discs were about 3 feet apart. Quote, "Suddenly the area between them began to glow with a soft green light, which gradually formed into a luminous three-dimensional screen." Unquote. In it there appeared the heads and shoulders of two persons, a man and a woman, quote, "being the ultimate of perfection." Unquote. They had large, shiny eyes, and, despite the supernatural perfection, they seemed strangely familiar to him. They observed him and the whole scene. It seemed to him that he was in telepathic communication with them. As suddenly as it had come, the vision vanished, and the fireballs resumed their former brilliance, and he heard the words, "The road will open, Orfeo," and the voice continued, "We see the individuals of Earth as no one really is. We see the individuals of Earth as each one really is, Orfeo, and not as perceived by the limited sense of humans. The people of your planet have been under observation for centuries, but have only recently been resurveyed. Every point of progress in your society is registered with us. We know you as you do not know yourselves. Every man, woman, and child is recorded in vital statistics by means of our recording crystal discs. Each of you is infinitely more important to us than your fellow Earthlings, because you are not aware of the true mystery of your being. We feel a deep sense of brotherhood towards Earth's inhabitants because of an ancient kinship of our planet with the Earth. In you, we can look far back in time and recreate certain aspects of our former world. With deep compassion and understanding, we have watched your world going through its growing pains. We ask that you look upon us simply as older brothers. Unquote. The author was also informed that the UFOs were remote controlled by a mothership. The occupants of UFOs needed, in reality, no such vessel. And as etheric entities, they needed them only in order to manifest themselves materially to humans. The UFOs could travel approximately the speed of light. The speed of light is the speed of truth, i.e., quickest thought. The heavenly visitors were harmless and filled with the best intention. Cosmic law forbade spectacular landings on Earth. The Earth was at present threatened by greater dangers than it realized. After these revelations, Angelucci felt exalted and strengthened. It was as though momentarily I had transcended mortality and was somehow related to these superior beings. Unquote. When the lights disappeared, it seemed to him that the everyday world had lost its reality and become an abode of shadows. On July 23, 1952, he felt unwell and stayed away from work. In the evening, he took a walk, and on the way back, in a lonely place, similar sensations came over him as he had felt on May 23rd. Combined with them was the, quote, the dulling of consciousness I had also noted on the other occasion, unquote, i.e., the awareness of an abaissement de niveau mental, sort of a lowing of the mental state, a state which is very important precondition of the occurrence of a spontaneous psychic phenomena. Suddenly he felt a luminous object on the ground before him, like an igloo or a huge misty soap bubble. These are both quoted. This object visibly increased in solidity, and he saw something like a doorway leading to a brightly lit interior. He stepped inside and found himself in a vaulted room about 18 feet in diameter. The walls were made of some, quote, etherical mother-of-pearl stuff, unquote. Facing him was a comfortable reclining chair consisting of the same translucent shimmering substance. Otherwise the room was empty and silent. He sat down and had the feeling that he was suspended in air, as if the chair molded itself into the shape of his body of its own accord. The door shut as if there had never been a door there at all. Then he heard a kind of humming, a rhythmic sound like a vibration, which put him in a kind of semi-drawn state. The room grew dark, and music came from the walls. Then it grew light again. He found on the door a piece of a metal-like coin. When he took it in his hand, it seemed to diminish in size. He had the feeling that the UFO was carrying him away. Suddenly, something like a round window appeared about 9 feet in diameter. Outside, he saw a planet, the Earth, and from a distance over 1,000 miles, as a voice he recognized explained to him. He wept with emotion, and the voice said, "Weep, Orfeo, we weep with you for Earth and her children. For all its apparent beauty, Earth is a purgatorial world among the planets evolving intelligent life. Hate, selfishness, and cruelty rise from many parts of it like dark mist." Unquote. Then, he says, the craft evidently moved out into the cosmic space. Through the window he saw a UFO about 1,000 feet long and 90 feet thick, consisting of a transparent crystalline substance. Music poured from it, bringing visions of harmoniously revolving planets and galaxies. The voice informed him that every being on Earth was divinely created, and upon your world the mortal shadows of those entities are working out their salvation from the plane of darkness. All the entities were either on the good side or the bad side. "We know where you stand, Orfeo." Owing to his physical weakness, he had spiritual gifts, and this is why the heavenly beings could enter into communication with him. He was given to understand that the music as well as the voice emanating from this huge spaceship. It moved off slowly, and he noticed at either end of it vortices of flame that served as propellers, but they were also instruments for seeing and hearing through some method of telepathic contact. On the way back, they met two ordinary UFOs traveling earthwards. The voice entertained him with more explanations concerning the attitude of the higher beings to mankind. And humans have not kept pace morally and psychologically with their technological development, and therefore the inhabitants of other planets were trying to install into the Earth dwellers a better understanding of their present predicament, and to help them particularly in the art of healing. They also wanted to put Orfeo about right about Jesus Christ. Jesus, so they said, was the Lord of the flame, an infinite entity of the sun, and not of earthly origin. As Sun Spirit who sacrificed himself for the children of woe, he has become a part of the oversoul of mankind and the world spirit. In this he differs from all other cosmic teachers. Everyone on earth had a spiritual, unknown self, which transcends the material world and consciousness, and dwells eternally outside of the time dimension in spiritual perfection within the unity of the Oversoul. The sole purpose of human existence on earth is to attain reunion with the immortal consciousness. Under the searching eye of this great, compassionate consciousness, Orfeo felt like a clawing worm, uncleaned, filled with error and sin. He wept, once more to the accompaniment of appropriate music. The voice spoke and said, "Beloved friend of earth, we baptize you now in the true light of the world's eternal." A white flash of lightning blazed forth. His life lay clear before his eyes, and the remembrance of all his previous existences came back to him. He understood the mystery of life. He thought he was going to die, for he knew at this moment he wafted into eternity, into timeless sea of bliss. After this illuminative experience, he came to himself again. Accompanied by the obligatory etheric music, he was borne back to earth. As he left the UFO, it suddenly vanished without a trace. Afterwards, on going to bed, he noticed a burning sensation on the left side of his chest. There he found a stigma the size of a 25-cent bit, an inflamed circle with a dot in the middle. He interpreted it as a symbol of the hydrogen atom. His career as a Gospeller dates true to form from this experience. He became a witness not only of the word, but of the UFO, and was exposed to the mockery and disbelief that are a lot of the martyr. On the night of August 2 of the same year, he saw with 8 other witnesses an ordinary UFO in the sky, which disappeared after a short time. He betook himself to a lonely spot he had previously visited, but though he didn't find the UFO, he met a figure who called out to him, "Greetings, Orfeo!" It was the same figure he saw in the earlier vision, who wished to be called by the name Neptune. He was a tall, handsome man, with unusually large and expressive eyes. The edges of the figure rippled like water in the wind. Neptune gave him more information concerning the earth, and reasons for its lamentable condition and its coming redemption. Then he vanished. At the beginning of September 1953, he fell into a somnambulistic state that lasted about a week. When he returned to his normal consciousness, he remembered everything he had experienced during his absence. He had been on a small planetoid where Neptune dwelt with his companion Lyra, or rather, he had been in heaven, as Orfeo imagined it, with countless flowers, delightful odors, colors, nectar and ambrosia, noble etheric beings, and, of course, almost incessant music. There he discovered that his heavenly friend was not called Neptune, but Orion, and that Neptune had been only his name while he was still dwelling in this heavenly world. Lyra showed him particular marks of attention, to which he, the re-remembered Neptune, in accordance with his earthly nature, responded with erotic feelings, much to the horror of the celestial company. When he had habituated himself with some effort from this all-too-human reaction, a Noce Celeste was celebrated, a mystic union analogous to the Conjunctio Oppositorium in alchemy. With this climax, I will end the account of this pèlerinage d'âme, without having the faintest inkling of psychology, and Angelecci had described in greatest detail the mystic experience associated with UFO vision. A detailed commentary by me is hardly necessary. The story is so naive and clear that a reader interested in psychology can see at once how far it confirms my previous conclusions. It could even be regarded as a unique document that sheds a great deal of light on the genius and assimilation of UFO mythology. That is why I have left Angelucci to have his say. The psychological experience that is associated with the UFO consists in the vision of the rotundum, the symbol of wholeness and the archetype that expresses itself in a mandala form. Mandalas, as we know, usually appear in situations of psychic confusion and perplexity. The archetype thereby constellated represents a pattern of order which, like a psychological viewfinder, marked with a cross or circle divided into four, is superimposed on the psychic chaos so that each content falls into place and the weltering confusion is held together by the protective circle. The Eastern mandalas in Mahayana Buddhism accordingly represent the cosmic, temporal, and psychological order. At the same time, they are yantras, instruments with whose help the order is brought into being. Footnote from the Psychological Foundation, see K.W. Bash, H. Al Lenstein, and R. Kaufman. End of footnote. As our time is characterized by fragmentation, confusion, and perplexity, this fact is also expressed in the psychology of the individual, appearing in spontaneous fantasy images, dreams, and products of active imagination. I have observed these phenomena in my patients for 40 years and have come to the conclusion that this archetype is of central importance, or rather, that it gains in importance to the degree that the importance of the ego is lost. A state of disorientation is particularly apt to depotentiate the ego. Psychologically, the rotundum or mandala is a symbol of the self. The self is the archetype of order par excellence. The structure of the mandala is arithmetical, for whole numbers are likewise archetypes of order. This is true particularly of a number 4, the Pythagorean tritractis. Since a state of confusion is generally the result of psychic conflict, we find in practice that the dyad, or the conjoined two, is also associated with the mandala. This appears in Angelucci's vision of the synthesis of opposites. Its central position gives the symbol of a high feeling value expressed, for instance, in Angelucci's stigmatization. The symbols of the self coincide with the God images, as, for instance, the complexia oppositorium of Cusanus with the dyad, or the definition of God as a, quote, circle whose center is everywhere and the circumference is nowhere, unquote, with Angelucci's sign of the hydrogen atom. It was marked not by the Christian stigmata, but by the symbol of the self, of absolute wholeness, or, in religious language, God. These psychological connections give rise to the alchemical equation between Christ and the lapis philosophorum. The center is frequently symbolized by an eye, the ever-open eye of the fish in alchemy, or the unsleeping God eye of conscience, or the all-seeing sun. The same symbols are experienced today, not as external light phenomena, but as psychic revelation. I would like to mention an example in the case of a woman who wrote down her experience in verse form. It has no connection with UFOs. Vision. Light strikes the pebbled bottom of a deep blue pool. Through swaying grass, a jewel flickers, gleams, and turns, demands attention as I pass. A staring fish eyes glance attracts my mind and heart. The fish, invisible as glass, a shimmering silver moon. The fish, assuming shape and form, evolves a whirring, swirling dance. Intensity of light increases. The disk becomes a blazing golden sun, compelling deeper contemplation. End of verse. The water is the depths of the unconscious into which a ray from the light of consciousness is penetrating. A dancing disk of fish eyes swims down below in the inner darkness instead of a flying in the heaven, and from it arises a world illuminating sun, an Icarus, a soul invictus, an ever open eye which reflects the eye of the beholder, and is at the same time something independent of her, a rotundum that expresses the wholeness of the self and cannot be distinguished, except conceptually, from the deity. Fish, Ichthys, and sun, noble soul, are allegories of Christ, which, like the eye, stand for God. In the moon and sun appear the Divine Mother and her Son Lover, as can be seen today in many churches. The UFO vision follows the old rule and appears in the sky. Orfeo's fantasies are played out in the obviously heavenly place, and his cosmic friends bear the name of stars. If they are not antique gods or heroes, they are at least angels. The author certainly lives up to his name, for just as his wife, née Borgiani, is, in his opinion, a descendant of the Borgias of unhappy memory, so he, an earthly copy of the angels, and a messenger, brings the Eleusinian tidings of immortality, and must style himself a new Orpheus, divinely appointed to initiate us into the mystery of the UFOs. Not even the Orphean strains are lacking. If the name is a deliberately chosen pseudonym, we can only say "e ben trovato." But if it appears in his birth certificate, then the matter becomes more problematical. Today, we can no longer suppose that a magical compulsion attaches to a mere name, else we should have to attribute a correspondingly sinister significance to his spouse or the animal. Much as we would like to credit him with an intellectually rather limited naive good faith, we would have reason to suspect that a quite fine Italian hand is at work. What appears impossible from the conscious standpoint can often be arranged by the unconscious with all the craftiness of nature. Ce qui diable ne peut, femme le fait. That which the devil can't do, women do. But that as it may, Orfeo's book is an essentially naive production, which, far more than very reason reveals all the more clearly the unconscious background of the UFO phenomenon, and therefore comes like a gift to the psychologist. The individuation process, the central problem of modern psychology, is plainly depicted in an unconscious symbolic form, which bears out our previous reflections, although the author, with his somewhat primitive mentality, has taken it quite literally as a concrete happening. This epilogue was already in the press when I received word of Fred Hoyle's book, The Black Cloud, London, 1957. The author is a well-known authority on astrophysics, and I was already acquainted with his two impressive volumes, The Nature of the Universe and Frontiers of Astronomy. They are brilliant expositions of the latest developments in astronomy and show their author as a bold and imaginative thinker. The fact that such an author should report to a science fiction story aroused my curiosity, and I read the book at once. Hoyle himself, in his preface, describes it as a frolic, a jest, and warns against anyone identifying the views of his hero, a mathematician of genius, with his own. No intelligent reader will fall into this error, of course. Nevertheless, he will hold Professor Hoyle responsible for the authorship of his book, and he will ask him what it was that induced him to tackle the UFO problem. In his yarn, Hoyle describes how a young astronomer at Mount Palomar Observatory, while looking for supernovae to the south of Orion, discovers a dark circular patch in a dense field of stars. It is a so-called globulus, a dark cloud of gas, which it transpires is moving towards our solar system. At the same time, in England, considerable disturbances are detected in the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn. The reason for this is calculated by a Cambridge mathematician, the hero of our story, as a definite mass which, it turns out, is located exactly at the spot where the Americans discovered the black cloud. This globulus, whose diameter is approximately equal to the distance of the Sun from the Earth, consists of hydrogen of fairly high density and is moving straight towards the Earth at 40 miles a second. It will reach the Earth in about 18 months. As the black cloud gets nearer, it causes first all sorts of terrible heat that kills off a large part of the life on Earth. This is followed by a total extinction of light and more like Egyptian darkness lasting for about a month, a nigrido, like that described in the Aurora Consurgens, a treatise ascribed to St. Thomas of Aquinas. Quote, "Beholding from afar, I saw a great cloud looming black over all the earth, that had absorbed the black earth which covered my soul." End quote. When the light reappears again, there follows a period of terrible cold, which causes another appalling catastrophe. Meanwhile, the scientists in question have been shut up by the British government in their experimental location, where, thanks to the security measures they have taken, they survive the catastrophes. By observing certain remarkable ionization phenomena in the atmosphere, they come to the conclusion that these are intentionally induced and that, in consequence, there must be an intelligent agent in the black cloud. By means of radio, they succeed in entering into communication with it and receive answers. They learn that the cloud is 500 million years old and is at present engaged in regenerating itself. It has taken up its position near the sun in order to recharge itself with energy. In fact, it is feeding on the sun. The scientists discover that the cloud must eliminate all radioactive substances, and these are harmful to it. This fact is also discovered by the American observers, and at their instigation, the cloud is fired at with H-bombs with the intention of killing it. The cloud, meanwhile, has settled in a disk around the sun, consequently threatening the Earth with a 6-month eclipse of several weeks' duration. The English naturally have a host of questions to ask the cloud, including its metaphysical question concerning a greater being of still greater age and even deeper wisdom and scientific knowledge. The cloud replies that it has already discussed the matter with other globuli, but is as much in the dark about it as human beings. It is willing, however, to communicate its own greater knowledge directly to mankind. A young physicist declares himself ready to submit to the experiment. He gets into a hypnotic condition, but dies in a sort of inflammation of the brain before being able to make any communication. The Cambridge mathematician of genius now offers himself for experiment, on the condition accepted by the cloud that the process of communication shall take place very much more slowly. In spite of that, he falls into a delirium which ends in his death. The cloud, however, has decided to quit the solar system and seek out another region of fixed stars. The sun emerges again from obscurity, and everything as before, except for the tremendous destruction of Earth for life. It is not difficult to see that the author here has taken up the UFO problem, so characteristic of our epoch. From outer space, a round object approaches the Earth and causes a worldwide catastrophe. Although the legend usually considers the catastrophic political situation, or rather nuclear fission, to be the indirect cause of the UFO phenomenon, there are not a few people who suspect the real danger lies in the appearance of UFOs themselves, namely an invasion of the Earth by star dwellers, which might give an unexpected and probably undesirable turn in our already questionable situation. The strange idea that the black cloud possesses a sort of nervous system and a psyche or intelligence to match is not an original invention by the authors, since speculative UFOologists have already arrived at such hypotheses of a sentient electrical field, and also at the idea that UFOs are provisioning themselves with something on Earth: water, oxygen, small organisms, etc., just as the cloud charged itself with solar energy. The cloud causes opposite extremes of temperature, and an absolute nigredo, such as the old alchemists dreamed of. This illustrates a characteristic aspect of the psychological problem that arises when the light of day, consciousness, is directly confronted with night, the collective unconscious. Opposite of extremes intensely collide with one another, causing a disorientation and darkening of consciousness, which can assume threatening proportions, as in the initial stage of psychosis. This aspect, i.e., the analogy with a physic catastrophe, is shown by Hoyle in the confrontation between the psychic content of the cloud and the consciousness of the two unfortunate victims. Just as earthly life is largely wiped out by the collision with the cloud. So the psyche and the life of the two scientists are destroyed by the collision with the unconscious. For although the rotundum is a totality symbol, it usually encounters a consciousness that is not prepared for it and does not understand it, indeed is bound to misunderstand it and therefore cannot tolerate it, because it perceives the totality only in projected form outside itself and cannot integrate it as a subjective phenomenon. Consciousness commits the same grave mistake as the insane person. It understands the event as a concrete external happening and not as a subjective symbolical process. The result is that the external world gets into a hopeless disorder and is actually destroyed so far as the patient loses their relationship to it. He also suggests the analogy with psychosis of the delirious state of the victims. It is not only the insane person who makes the fundamental mistake, but all those who take philosophical or theosophical speculations for objective realities and consider the mere fact that they believe in angels as a guarantee that such things exist in reality. It is significant that it is the actual hero of the story, the mathematician of genius, who meets with disaster. No author can avoid equipping his hero or her hero with some of their own qualities and thus betraying that at least a part of themselves is invested in their hero. What happens to the hero also happens symbolically to the author. In this case, it is naturally unpleasant, for it amounts to nothing less than the fear that a collision with the unconscious would involve the destruction of the most differentiated function. It is a widespread, in fact, abnormal prejudice that deeper insight into unconscious motives must necessarily entail a fatal disturbance of the conscious performance. The most that can happen in an alteration of the cosmic attitude. Since in our story everything is projected outside, humankind and all organic life on earth suffer an immense loss. The author makes no particular to-do about this. It is mentioned only as a sort of byproduct. From this we may infer a predominantly intellectual attitude of consciousness. Presumably not altogether unimpressed by 100 or more H-bombs, which might well upset its nervous system with their radioactivity, the black cloud withdraws as suddenly as it came. Nothing whatsoever has been learned by its context except that it knows as little about metaphysical supreme being as we do. Nevertheless, its intelligence proves unendurably high for human beings, so that it has come suspiciously near to having a divine or angel-like nature. Here the great astronomer joins hands with the naive Angelucci. Understood psychologically, the story describes fantasy contents whose symbolical nature demonstrates their origin in the unconscious. Whenever a confrontation of this kind occurs, there is usually an attempt to integration. This is expressed in the intention of the cloud to remain for some time near the sun in order to feed on its energy. Psychologically, this would mean that the unconscious draws strength and life from its union with the sun. The sun loses no energy, but the earth and its life, signifying human, loses a great deal. Human has to pay the costs of this invasion or interruption of the unconscious. The psychic life is threatened with the gravest injury. What then, psychologically speaking, is the meaning of this cosmic or rather psychic collision? Obviously, the unconscious darkens the consciousness, since no rapprochement, no dialectical process takes place between their contents. For the individual, this means that the cloud deprives him of solar energy. In other words, his consciousness is overpowered by the unconscious. This is equivalent to a great general catastrophe, such as we have experienced in National Socialism and are still experiencing in the communist inundation, where an archaic social order threatens our freedom with tyranny and slavery. Human replies to this catastrophe with their best weapon. Whether for this reason or from a change in mind, as seems more likely, the cloud withdraws to other regions. This means psychologically the unconscious, after gaining a certain amount of energy, sinks back again to its former distance. The final outcome is depressing. Human consciousness and life in general suffer an incalculable loss through incomprehensible lensus naturae that lacks all human meaning, a frolic on a cosmic scale. This in turn points to something psychic that is not understood by the present. Though the nightmare is over for the survivors, from now on they live in a devastated world. Consciousness has suffered a loss of its own reality, as though the evil dream had robbed it of something essential and made off with it. The loss involved in such a collision consists in missing a unique opportunity, which may never come again, to come to terms with the contents of the unconscious. Although it was possible to establish an intelligent connection with the cloud, the communication of its contents proved to be unendurable and led to the death of those who submitted to the experiment. Nothing is learned of the contents from the other side. The encounter with the unconscious ends bootlessly. Our knowledge is not enriched, and on this point we remain where we were before the catastrophe. The only thing is that we know we are at least half a world poorer. The scientific pioneers, the spokesmen of the avant-garde, proved too weak or too immature to receive the message from the unconscious. It remains to be seen whether this melancholy outcome is a prophecy or a subjective confession. If we compare this tale to the naivetes of Angelucci, we get a valuable picture of the difference between the uneducated and the scientifically educated attitude. Both shift the problem into the concrete. The one in order to make us believe in a saving action from heaven, the other in order to transform the secret yet somewhat sinister expectation into an entertaining literary joke. Both, poles apart though they are activated by the same unconscious factor and make use of essentially the same symbolism in order to express the unconscious straits we are in. Supplement. An equally recent book, a novel by John Wyndham called The Midwich Cuckoos, London and New York, 1957, attributes to a thing, which is obviously a UFO, a highly significant character. Of unknown but presumably extraterrestrial origin, this thing casts a spell on a small remote English village, causing people and beasts to fall into a hypnotic sleep which lasts 24 hours. The zone of sleep describes a circle around the village, and any living being that approaches instantly falls asleep when the magical line is crossed. After 24 hours, everybody revives, and nothing seems to have happened on the surface. But several weeks later, peculiar discoveries are made. The first one, and then another, of female population. And finally, all the members capable of fecundation are found to be pregnant. In due course, children are born with golden eyes. When they develop, they begin to show signs of uncommon intelligence. Later, it becomes known that the same miracle had befallen a village in Siberia, an Eskimo settlement, and an African village. In England, owing to the remoteness and insignificance of the locality, the village authorities succeed in hushing up the public scandal. The extraordinary intelligence of the children inevitably leads to trouble, and a special school is found for them. The amazing fact is discovered that if one of the boys had learned something new and hitherto unknown, all the boys knew it, and the same is true for girls, so that only one boy and one girl have to attend school. Finally, the precacious schoolteacher can no longer doubt that the children with golden eyes represent a superior type of Homo sapiens. Their advanced intelligence is moreover coupled with the complete realization of their potential power for world domination. The question of how to deal with this menace leads to different solutions. The Africans kill the children immediately. The Eskimos expose them to the cold. The Russians, after isolating the village, destroy it by bombarding it. But in England, the favorite teacher introduces some boxes, apparently containing laboratory equipment, but actually containing dynamite, into the classroom, and blows himself up with all the children. The particular parthenogenesis and the golden eyes denote kinship with the sun and characterize the children as divine progeny. Their fathers seem to have been the angels of the Annunciation who had come down from a super celestial place to take care of the stupidity and backwardness of Homo sapiens. It is a divine intervention that gives evolution a definite push forward, or expressed in more modern terms, an advanced species of human from some other planet visits the Earth in order to make biological experiments with mutation and artificial insemination. But the modern Neanderthal man, human, is in no way ready to renounce the prerogatives of the ruling race and prefers to maintain the status quo by the devastating methods which have always been their final argument. It is obvious that the sun children, miraculously begotten, represent an unexpected capacity for a wider and higher consciousness, superseding a backward and an inferior mental state. Nothing is said, however, about a higher feeling and moral level, which would be necessary to compensate and regulate the possibilities of advanced perception and intellect. Characteristically enough, this aspect does not seem to enter the author's field of vision. It is sufficient for the author that the children have a definite advantage of some kind over contemporary humans. What if the children should symbolize the germ of some higher potentiality transcending the hitherto valid form of human? In this case, the story looks very like a time-honored repetition of the hero's threatened childhood and his early death through treachery. On the other hand, there is something definitely suspect about these children. They are not separated individually, but live in a permanent state of participation mystique, or unconscious identity that precludes individual differentiation and development. Had they been spared an early extinction, they would have founded an entirely uniform society, the deadly boredom of which would have been the very ideal of a Marxist state. Thus the negative end of the story remains a matter for doubt. End.